Greetings, leaders. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Leadership Is Podcast. I am your host, Jason Muhammad, founder of JM Leadership Consulting. Today's discussion is the effective leader. What makes an effective leader? And really, more importantly, what makes an ineffective leader and how to avoid it. We're going to discuss that today. Thank you for joining. Greetings, leaders. Thank you so much for joining us for the episode of Leadership Is Podcast. Today's discussion is the effective leader. What makes an effective leader? And again, more importantly, is what makes an ineffective leader. Once you discover what makes an ineffective leader, then you can just, it's not really as easy as just doing the opposite. But again, it starts with doing the opposite, right? So, the effective leader. Why do we need effective leaders, in this day and time? I have seen a lot of leaders and leadership development programs just kind of waste time with people, right? As they're striving to say that they're developing, simply because, most of these leadership development programs are based on a model, right, that is from a time that no longer exists. So you have to think about, when you're developing a program, you have to be efficient, right? But then you have to be up to date as it relates to the ideal participant in your leadership development program. I have been recently reading a book here by Jacob Morgan. It is based on interviews with over 140 CEOs and a survey of nearly 14,000 employees. And the book is entitled The Future Leader. And in his book on page 13, right, he talks about a couple of things here. He says, in the most recent Global Leadership Forecast report, DDI, which is Development Dimensions International, surveyed over 25,000 leaders around the world and found that only 42% said that the overall quality of leadership inside their organizations was high. Now, this is based on a 2018 survey. Now, you have to keep in mind that a lot of numbers are going to change based on the fact of this COVID-19 and social injustice and the health and economic pandemic has had on the effect that it has had on today's economy. So, but again, this is from 2018 here, right? He also says perhaps more shocking was that only 14% of organizations have what DDI calls a strong bench, which is ready now leaders who can step in to replace those who retire or move on. Why is that important? Simply because when DDI did a survey with these 25,000 leaders, they found that there were 10 challenges that leaders have, and the number one challenge was developing next generation leaders. 64 of the participants responded in the survey that their number one challenge was developing next generation leaders. And so next generation leaders is very important when you're thinking that, in 2025, 75% of the workforce is going to be, mostly millennials, right? And so by 2021, 50% of the workforce is going to be millennials. So which means that the baby boomers, who mostly came into the workforce based on, economic development, money, right? That was their real incentive. But the millennials are not really focused on money. Millennials and even Gen Xers, right? They're focused more on personal growth and development. And so if you're going to be an effective leader, you have to look at the modern times and the modern people that you're putting in place there. So many people may have this idea of thinking that, millennials are kind of spoiled, or they are, unengaged, right? But quite possibly you just haven't figured out, what attracts them and what inspires them and what will get them engaged. And so do some study on that, all right? So again, but why record a podcast about the effective leader? Well, again, that's why, because we want to talk about next generation leaders. But in order for you to really be a next generation leader, what does a next generation leader look like? So let's start off by, let's look at what an ineffective leader looks like and produces. An ineffective leader is one that it has a lack of influence, unengaged employees, company is hemorrhaging money, has a toxic culture, lack of team synergy, bad customer reviews, and of course lack of accountability. Now, lack of accountability is really one of the 5 dysfunctions of a team from Patrick Lencioni, as he talks about the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Go back and read his book and listen to his talks on YouTube or whatever medium that you use for your media. But again, there are 7 qualities of an ineffective leader, right? There's lack of influence, unengaged employees, company is hemorrhaging money, toxic culture, lack of team synergy, bad customer reviews, lack of accountability. So there are things and systems, policies, and procedures that are in place, right, that actually upholds this lack of influence and unengaged employees and companies hemorrhaging money. There are systems that are set up to actually help companies and leaders to not have these 7 traits of an ineffective leader, right? So, however, until you can learn what those systems are, and of course I could teach those systems as well from studying them, you would need to actually pay close attention to yourself as a leader and see if you have these 7 ineffective leadership traits. And if so, I would advise you to immediately get busy, right, working on changing that, because again, that is a spiral, right, a downward spiral as it relates to your leadership. So John C. Maxwell talks about the 5 levels of leadership, right? The first one is position, then there's permission, production, people development, and pinnacle. What I have discovered in many fields that I have been into is most people don't get past the position level of leadership. Pardon me. What does that mean? That means that this person has been promoted into a leadership position, has a title, function, and authority, and is over relying, right, on that position and that title as a leader for their leadership. And so they're just expecting that simply because they have this title, this function, and this authority, people must follow. And most people will follow you starting off like that, right? Because of the loyalty that they have to the company and to the brand. They will follow your leadership, at first, for a while, based on the fact that you have a position, title and authority. However, that will soon wear off, and what you will start seeing when that wears off is the lack of influence. You start seeing the 7 character traits of an ineffective leader, right? The lack of influence, unengaged employees, company, or even your department is hemorrhaging money. There's a toxic culture, lack of team synergy, bad customer reviews, lack of accountability, right? So when you're an underdeveloped, inefficient, or even a bad leader, you over rely on your position and title instead of utilizing your impactful influence in order to serve your people. I remember when I was a dean of students for a very progressive middle school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, called the Best Academy, and I was invited to go to New York for a training by the author of the book Teach Like a Champion, Mr. Doug Lamothe, and it was a train the trainers type of workshop there. And one of the things he says in his book is that many schools over rely on the management system, right? The management system is what many people call discipline, right? Discipline system. But he talks about in chapter 5, the 5 principles of classroom culture. He talks about, the difference between management and discipline. So, but management is what many people, call the discipline system, right? And many people look at their discipline or their behavior management system as punitive instead of engaging. So that's in a school setting, right? That's over relying on a management or a behavior management system to keep students in line instead of having control and engaging them, right, with influence. So if you are one who is, when you are underdeveloped, inefficient, or even a bad leader with the 7 character traits of an ineffective leader, you over rely on your position and title instead of utilizing your impactful influence in order to serve your people. So how can we help? Well, here's what we can do here, right? The saying is, don't study where you fail, study where you stumbled. So let's look at some statistics here, right? We've shared these statistics in other podcasts. Let's look at some statistics. Employees, right? So 85% of employees are not engaged or actively disengaged. 41% of employees strongly agree that they understand what their company stands for. Only 41%. So these people come in, apply for a job, search for a job, apply for the job, go in for the interview, right? And then accept the job, accept the position, but only 41% of employees strongly agree that they understand what their company stands for. So if you are an ineffective leader who is not making sure that everyone understands, the KPIs, the mission and core values of your company, you're failing your company, right? And you're failing as a leader, because if your people do not strongly have an attachment to the KPIs, the principles, core values, and the mission of the company, then they're just you really have to question their motive for coming in, right? So again, 88% of employees feel undervalued. 58% would trust a stranger over their boss. 65% would trade their salary to fire their boss, right? So this is what, these are the results of an ineffective leader, right? An ineffective leader, one that has the 7 characteristics of an ineffective leader: the lack of influence, unengaged employees, company is hemorrhaging money, toxic culture, lack of team synergy, bad customer reviews, and of course, lack of accountability. And I should add an 8th one in there, which is over relying on their position, but we'll keep it as the 7th one right here, only 7 here. So now, if that's the traits of an ineffective leader, what are the traits of an effective leader? So what we're going to do here is we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will discuss this. Thank you so much. Greetings, leaders. I'm here to talk to you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone and or computer. Now, how convenient is that? Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast, too, with no minimum listenership. So it's everything that you need to make a podcast in one place. So do me a favor. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. I look forward to seeing the greatness within you. Hey, thank you so much for joining us back with the episode of Leadership Is Podcast, as we're discussing today the effective leader and what makes an effective leader. And again, as we stated in the beginning, really more importantly, what are the 7 characteristic traits of an ineffective leader. So those 7 characteristic traits that we spoke about in the beginning of this podcast was lack of influence, unengaged employees, company hemorrhaging money, toxic culture, lack of team synergy, bad customer reviews, and of course lack of accountability. And so those are 7 traits of an ineffective leader. So what we want to talk about is the effective leader, right? What makes an effective leader? Well, the effective leader starts with self-leadership. See, and with this self-leadership, it starts off with having the 3 mindsets of a great leader, which is adaptive, innovative, and connecting. And then what happens is you use your influence and your empathy and consistency and how it impacts your ideal customer, your employee or your partners, and your overall organization. So self-leadership. So being an effective leadership starts with self-leadership. As I always state, my podcast, I use a lot of acronyms. I love acronyms, right? Using them to help us to understand everyday language that we use as leaders. So it's not to change your vocabulary, but to simply expand your dictionary, right? So here is another acronym that I use here is SELF. SELF. The effective leader starts with self-leadership. The S stands for service. It stands for service, right? And then the E is for empathy. The L is for learning, and the F is for focus. Now, we talked about in our last podcast about focus and what focus means. And focus, is an acronym within itself, right? And so you can go back and listen to the previous episode of Leadership Is that talks about focus, FOCUS, and get the understanding from that. But the effective leader starts with self-leadership. So it starts with service, right? Service. How do you serve your employees? How do you serve your community? How do you serve your partners? How do you serve your ideal client and customers, right? And so you have to look at what is your product, what is your service that you offer them, and is it based on what they are desiring or based on what you want to have? I remember listening to a LinkedIn webinar by Gary Vaynerchuk, and what he said on there is, he said, fall in love with your ideal customer and not your product. Because see, when you fall in love with your ideal customer is one who's not only long-standing, but loyal, and is also providing you with what? Free advertisement, free word of mouth, right? Spreading the word about your company. So that is, and spending a lot of money and loyal to your company and your brand. So that's your ideal customer. He says, fall in love with them versus your product. Why? Because your ideal customer will let you know, what changes you would need to make to your product and to your services, how to update your product and your services, right? Because they've already shown loyalty. They've already invested, got skin in the game by investing or purchasing or being loyal to the product, right? So that's your ideal customer. So how do you serve your ideal customer? How do you serve your employees? There was a webinar that I saw from Customer First that talks about your EX equals your CX, and so I'm bringing this down, right, with the service. So what they meant by your EX equals your CX is your employee experience equals your customer experience. Right? So one of the things they were saying was that, most of them felt better about, their experience and satisfied as a customer leaving from a store, but when they felt that their employee was happy, you see. And so now you have to go back into thinking, the culture that the employee is in, the practices that the employees are in, right? So again, once you go back to the statistics, 41% of employees strongly agree that they understand what their company stands for. So that not having confidence in what the company stands for could, can trigger some of this disengagement. This 85% of employees who are not engaged or actively disengaged, right, in that company. So you want to monitor that. So how do you serve your customer? How do you serve your employee? How do you serve your community? Right, and so investing back into your community, not necessarily or just with money, but then there's there's products, there's school supplies, there's food, right, that you can stock up in some of the local pantries there. So how do you serve your community? Then your community, of course, also is your entire organization. How do you serve your community? How do you serve your organization? So the effective leader starts with self-leadership, and SELF, service, empathy, learning, and focus. So the first one is service. So you got to be a servant. So I believe that reading in this book that's called the Bible, the word leader, right, is mentioned about 6 times, but the term servant leader, right, or servant is written in there, multiple times. So, maybe over 90 times or something like that. That's in that book, right? So it's more about being a servant leader, right? Serving your people, serving your ideal clients, serving your partners, serving your investors and your funders, right? Serving your community. But then even with self, it starts by serving yourself. You have to take care of yourself as a leader. You got to feed yourself. You got to feed your mentality. You got to feed the mindset, right? You got to feed yourself healthy foods even. See, this is some basic stuff, man, that I talk about on these podcasts. But one of the problems is that people have strayed away from the basic foundation. And when you've strayed away from the basic foundation of going into all of these complicated, and more complex, right, dealings, and you've moved on from the basics, and then if you have lost your root from the basics, you got a shaky foundation. So what I do is I look at leadership from the bottom up, rebuilding, restructuring, right, the leader from within, so that the leader can then have a strong base, a strong foundation to build whatever they're going to build. So you have to stay connected to your roots. And so SELF, service. The next one is empathy. Empathy, another terms for empathy is emotional intelligence. See, empathy is one of the 4 changes that are going to take place as it relates to this COVID-19. There's going to be more empathetic, leaders, listening leaders. They're going to be more, encouraging and courageous conversations that are going to be taking place, right? But empathy is being able to be in a conversation with an employee or ideal client or customer or partner or funder, and are paying close attention emotionally, right? What triggers them to be either engaged or disengaged, happy or angry. You are empathetic, right? You're listening with emotional intelligence, right? You can have a feeling of how this conversation, how this thing is going and moving. So you're in tune now with the emotions of it, right? And so that's the empathy. Now learning feeds into the 3 mindsets of great leaders, which is adaptive, innovative, and connecting, right? So which means that an effective leader or a the effective leader starts with self-leadership, right? And the L in the word self means learning, which means that an effective leader is always learning. always learning, right? Always learning how to be better at their job, always learning how to be a more effective leader, how to be greater at their influence, right? Always trying to learn how to grow their influence, how to engage their employees, how to save their company money, how to create an empowering culture, right? And bring in team synergy and get good customer reviews, and of course to hold themselves accountable. That's what they're always learning, right? They're learning how not to be one who has these 7 characteristics of a bad leader. And then of course the F in the effect or in the word self is focus. Effective leaders focus. Once they are learning and continuing to learn, they start to focus on what it is that they're supposed to do based on what they have learned. And focus, of course, is its own acronym, which is to fully organize concentration until success. And so what they concentrate on is what they actually have learned, right? This is why, my podcast is not just a talking podcast, it's a training podcast, right? So I give some training in these podcasts. I don't just talk and we talk, but there's some training, there's some connection that we're making with our audience, right? To go back and look at their chalkboards or look at their whiteboards or even look at their canvases, right? And start designing out and start going back and looking at their programs that they have within their companies and say, hey, look, how can we adopt, right? This type of structure here within our company. This is, again, some basic stuff, but some stuff that people may not have remembered or have forgotten about, right? So again, the effective leader starts with self-leadership, service, empathy, learning, and focus. And once you do this, right, you start looking at, okay, the results and the outcomes that it has on, or in the impact that it has on your ideal customer, your employees and your partners, and of course your overall organization. The effective leader starts with self-leadership. Hey, thank you so much for enjoying another episode of Leadership Is Podcast. Today's discussion, we talked about what makes an effective leader. And of course, we also talked about what makes an ineffective leader as well. Being an effective leader starts with self-leadership. And we stated that self stands for service, empathy, learning, and focus, right? So service, empathy, learning, and focus. And the learning aspect of self-leadership feeds into the 3 mindsets of great leaders. So again, great or effective leaders, or the effective leader starts with self-leader or self-leadership. I work with emerging leaders, high potential employees, and students to develop and embrace a growth mindset for leadership. If you would like for us to do a presentation, keynote your next event, or for a free half-hour consultation, please contact us at jason@jmleadershipconsult.com, or you can visit my website, www.jmleadershipconsult.com, or call us 828-333-7234, and we will respond promptly. Please subscribe to this podcast using the Anchor app, or you can visit anchor.fm. Also, we're found on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as Jason A. Muhammad /Leadership Is. And please follow us on our social media, which is Twitter at LeadershipJM, Facebook and Instagram is JM Leadership Consulting. And always remember, leadership is influence and service.